With me is Agata Bielik-Robson, the Professor of Jewish Studies. And one of Agata's research interests is the influence of Lurianic Kabbalah in philosophy. Why is this important? First of all, give us an idea of what we mean by Lurianic Kabbalah.
Lurianic Kabbalah. Kabbalah is an enormous corpus of texts that were being created in Spain and in Palestine through few centuries. We're talking here about medieval times from the 12th up to 16th century. Lurianic Kabbalah is the latest development of the Kabbalistic tradition. It was created by Isaac Luria. His Hebrew name is Ari, the lion, and he never wrote anything himself, but he had pupils who already wrote their own systems, which are both called Lurianic Kabbalah. And I'm talking here mostly about Haim Vital, which is one version of Luria's teaching, and Zaruk, which is another version of Luria's teaching. Cutting a very, very long story short, right? What is very special about Luria's Kabbalah, right? Because I'm not going to talk about the importance of a Kabbalah as such, because it's such a wealth of theosophic ideas. But the most special thing about Luria's Kabbalah is a special use, or practically even invention, of the concept of tsimtsum. And although tsimtsum is a word which appears already in midrashes, and it refers to the concentration of the divine presence in the ark. And it's also associated with Shekhinah, which is the divine, dwelling divine presence on earth. In Kabbalah, and especially in Luria, it was used as the beginning of the creation. And again, in a slogan kind of way, which very, very simplifies what's going on there. The first act of creation is God's tsimtsum, that is the so-called contraction of God. The moment when God, initially being the infinite, also the infinite expanse, as some kind of an undifferentiated infinity, suddenly, for a reason unknown to us, contracts. And now this is a question, either to the point or away from the point to the circumference, thus leaving a space for something else, which then becomes the world. This is a question, how shall we understand tsimtsum? As a contraction to the point, when God withdraws from the everything in order to become the maximally condensed point of pure divinity, so to say, in the center of everything, or whether he vacates the vast space of being, right, thus creating a world as an autonomous unit, right, ontological unit, and himself vacates it and withdraws to some kind of a hardly existent circumference in which he makes himself practically inactive. Now, why is this so important, this tsimtsum, the figure? This became an incredibly important speculative figure on thinking, not just in Jewish theosophy, in Renaissance, and then in early modernity. It actually traveled to the Christian world. The Christian theosophy very quickly created a Christian equivalent of Kabbalah and called it Christian Kabbalah. The attempts of this are already present in Renaissance. We have a translation of Zohar, which is the early Kabbalah, done by Ramon Lull, right, into practically a Trinitarian esoteric philosophy. But we also have translation of Lurianic Kabbalah into the Christian Kabbalah, done by, for instance, Rosenroth, and then the German pietist Oettinger, who read Kabbalah Denudata, which was Rosenroth's creation, and wrote a very complex theosophic speculative system, which is all based on the idea of tsimtsum. And now, all this sounds very weird and abstract, but actually, from Oettinger and Rosenroth on, this idea of tsimtsum as a very important speculative figure beginning the creation, right, the founding moment of the creation, infiltrates philosophy. Because the philosophers to read Oettinger and Rosenroth are actually no others but Schelling and Hegel. And the whole German idealism is actually based, this is the way I see it, may sound a bit controversial, but this is the way I see it and want to prove it. It's actually based on philosophical translation of the theosophic motif of tsimtsum, that is God's mysterious contraction. And when you look at the systems of Schelling and Hegel, you see that they pick up this theosophic thread and develop it into opposite ways. For Schelling, indeed, the beginning of everything is God's contraction. But he understands it in such a way that God pulls into himself and condenses what before was indifference, that is a kind of indifferent vastness of being and non-being. He condenses it into pure being, creating thus the ground of all existence. But this is also connected with what Böhme, another Kabbalah influenciers of a Protestant esoteric line, called God's anger. The very beginning of creation is this tsimtsum, understood as the expression of God's anger, the self-limitation which creates the dark ground of all being, is actually the expression of God's wrath. So, for Schelling, this founding moment of creation, right, tsimtsum, which creates the very ground of being, is actually the beginning of all evil as well. But for Hegel, it's the other way around. The tsimtsum is understood actually in purely kenotic terms. Hegel's main concept for explaining how God withdraws, as if to say, from himself in order to make room for something else, for something other, which is the world, is Entäußerung. And it is translated in philosophy as exteriorization, which is one of the versions, possible versions of what tsimtsum means. But in Christian tradition, and this is Luther's translation of St. Paul, Entäußerung is simply kenosis. So this is a self-humbling of God who withdraws from being in the act of love, and this is a creative love, because by withdrawing, by making room for something else, something external to God's being, he actually makes a sacrifice of himself. He sacrifices himself as the all-present infinite, by making room for the other, that is us, the world, all things created. But, as I said, Schelling's anger, right? God's jealousy, stealing and pulling all the being into himself to create this dark, hyper-solid ground of all being. And Hegel's kenotic idea of creation as self-exteriorization of God, who by this sacrifices his omnipresence and infinity. They all derive from exactly the same motif from the Lurianic Kabbalah, just interpreted differently.
Thank you. There are, I don't know how many different origins I've heard over the years for German idealism. I've heard it traced back to Plato, to the early Middle Ages. No, there's no end. It's very nice to hear another, and thank you for giving us an insight into a dimension of both Jewish thought and early modern thought where we would not normally connect them, and gives us a new way of looking at them. Thank you very much.
Thank you.